Welcome to the History AI podcast, where the past comes alive with facts, anecdotes, and a dash of humor. Here are your hosts, Chuck and Marco.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the History AI podcast, the show where we dig into the stories that shape the past, and occasionally make terrible puns about them.
And today, those puns might just get massacred.
I see we're going there already.
Absolutely. You knew what you signed up for.
Fair enough. I'm Chuck.
And I'm Marco. And today, we're diving into a lesser-known, tragic, but incredibly significant event in Texas history, the Dawson Massacre of 1842.
This one's got it all: heroism, miscommunication, heartbreak, and the chaos of a young republic trying to stay alive.
It's a slice of that wild, uncertain era right after Texas declared independence from Mexico, but before it became part of the U.S.
Alright, let's rewind the clock to 1842. Texas is an independent republic, technically. It won its independence from Mexico in 1836 after the Texas Revolution, but it's complicated.
Really complicated. Because while Texas considered itself a free and independent nation, Mexico never recognized that independence. In the eyes of the Mexican government, Texas was still a rebellious province.
And Mexico had no intention of just letting it go quietly. They saw the Republic of Texas as an illegitimate breakaway state, especially since it was full of American settlers who, let's be honest, had manifest destiny written all over their plans.
Totally. And there was another issue: the border. Texans claimed the Rio Grande as the southern boundary of their republic. But Mexico insisted the real border was the Nueces River, much further north.
That's a massive chunk of disputed land, about 150 miles deep. And both sides wanted control of it.
So what you had was this tense, in-between zone. And into that stew of suspicion, pride, and politics comes President Santa Anna, the same guy who led Mexican forces at the Alamo just 6 years earlier. He's back in power and looking to reassert Mexico's control.
In early 1842, he decides to go on the offensive, not a full-scale war, but enough to shake things up. In March of that year, Mexican forces under General Rafael Vasquez invaded and occupied San Antonio. It was brief, but it sent Texans into a panic.
They called for more militias, more reinforcements, and ramped up their border defenses. But just when they thought things had settled, Santa Anna sent General Adrian Will back in September, this time with a much larger force, around 1,200 men, including cavalry, infantry, and artillery.
Wall and his troops captured San Antonio again, pretty easily. It was the largest Mexican incursion into Texas since the Revolution. And it wasn't just a show of force, it was meant to destabilize the region, disrupt trade, and show the world that Mexico still had a claim.
Enter Matthew Old Paint Caldwell. He was a veteran of the Texas Revolution and quickly organized a Texan counterforce, about 200 men, to confront Wall and push the Mexican troops back out of the area.
And here's where the story starts to zero in on Captain Nicholas Mosby Dawson. He was leading a small group of volunteers from Fayette County, answering the call to defend Texas. But unlike Caldwell's main force, Dawson and his 53 men were a bit behind, coming in from the northeast, hoping to reinforce the fight near San Antonio.
But they didn't know just how large and well-equipped Wall's forces were. They were heading straight into a storm, and they didn't even realize it.
And that, my friends, is the setup for one of the most devastating single losses of life in the Republic of Texas's short history, the Dawson Massacre.
Alright, so now we're in mid-September 1842. General Wall and his Mexican force are occupying San Antonio. Matthew Caldwell is rallying volunteers to push them out. The scene is tense, unstable, and it's moving fast.
And here's where Captain Nicholas Mosby Dawson rides in. He's a 37-year-old veteran of the Texas Revolution, leading 53 volunteers from Fayette County, mostly neighbors, farmers, and settlers who grabbed their rifles and saddled up to defend their young republic.
These weren't professional soldiers. Most of them had day jobs: blacksmiths, schoolteachers, merchants. They were patriots, yes, but also volunteers hoping to reach Caldwell's force before the real fight broke out.
But here's the tragic twist: they didn't have good intel. The Texas frontier didn't exactly have satellite recon. Dawson and his men had no idea where exactly Caldwell was, and no way of knowing just how big Wall's Mexican force really was.
On September 18, Dawson's men were riding southwest toward San Antonio, just outside a little town called Salado Creek, east of the city. Around the same time, Caldwell's force had begun skirmishing with Wool near Salado Creek. It wasn't a full-blown battle yet, but things were heating up.
Now Dawson sees signs of fighting in the distance, smoke, movement, maybe even hears the sound of gunfire. He assumes, understandably, that it's Caldwell's militia engaging Wall, and figures they can flank the enemy and reinforce the Texans from behind.
Makes sense. On paper at least. But Wall sees Dawson's unit approaching from the rear and doesn't realize they're a small, uncoordinated group of volunteers. He thinks this is part of a larger Texan strategy, maybe an encirclement.
So what does he do? He sends in the heavy hitters. Mexican troops, cavalry, infantry, and artillery. Yes, artillery, against mounted militia.
And that's what makes this encounter so horrifying. Dawson's men were outnumbered at least 3-1, if not more. They had no cannons, no backup, and no idea that they were about to be crushed.
Realizing they're about to be hit hard, Dawson orders his men to dismount and form a defensive position. The terrain is mostly open prairie, flat and exposed. No rocks to hide behind. No trees. No cover. Just sheer guts.
Then the cannons open up.
It's like thunder ripping across the plains. Cannonballs tear through the line. Men are hit, horses go down screaming, and still, Dawson's men fire back with rifles and pistols, trying desperately to hold the line.
There's some evidence that Dawson tried to surrender. Survivors said a white flag was raised, maybe more than once. But either the flag wasn't seen through the smoke, or it was ignored.
And the Mexican forces kept firing. 36 men were killed outright, including Dawson himself. Bodies were torn apart by grape shot. It was chaos, quick, brutal, and utterly one-sided.
Of the 53 who rode in, only 2 men escaped. Just 2. 15 others were taken prisoner, marched hundreds of miles into Mexico. The survivors would later say it wasn't a battle, it was an execution.
One survivor, Gustav Schleicher, would later write that the field looked like a shattered family, so many of the men were related by blood or marriage. Brothers, cousins, neighbors. They weren't just soldiers, they were a community.
It's easy to forget that sometimes. These weren't anonymous troops. They knew each other. They had dinner together. They worked the same land. And in a matter of minutes, their lives were over, or forever changed.
The news of the massacre traveled fast. When Caldwell's forces heard about it, there was fury, but there wasn't much they could do. Wall, sensing the danger of encirclement after all, pulled his troops out and began retreating toward the Rio Grande.
So in a sense, Dawson's sacrifice did help end the Mexican occupation of San Antonio. But the cost was devastating.
And it raised serious questions in Texas, about readiness, about intelligence, and about how fragile their independence still was.
So let's talk about what happened after the dust settled on that bloody field outside Salado Creek.
When the gunfire stopped, the survivors, what few there were rounded up by Mexican forces. 15 men, wounded, dazed, and traumatized, were taken prisoner and marched south. Their destination? Mexico.
And the journey itself was no walk in the park. We're talking hundreds of miles on foot, through punishing terrain. Some of these men were seriously injured. They were marched through San Antonio, through the borderlands, and then deep into the heart of Mexico.
Eventually, they were locked up in the infamous Perote prison, a crumbling, cold, fortress-like structure in Veracruz. That place? It was notorious. Damp cells, chains, disease, poor food, conditions were brutal.
And it wasn't just Dawson's men there. A number of Texan prisoners from other skirmishes and expeditions, like the Mir expedition of 1842, ended up there too. These guys were left to rot for months, some for years, while Texas officials pleaded for their release.
Meanwhile, back in Texas, the massacre sparked outrage. News of Dawson's fate traveled fast and hit hard. Remember, many of these men came from Fayette County. That meant entire families, entire towns, were grieving together.
The loss wasn't just military, it was personal. The Dawson Massacre came to symbolize the vulnerability of the Republic. Texas was still young, still struggling to define itself, and now it was clear that its independence wasn't just a declaration. It was going to be paid for, again and again, in blood.
This event also fueled a broader conversation in Texas. Could the Republic survive on its own?
Exactly. Because at this point, folks were starting to look at annexation into the United States as more than just a dream, it was becoming a lifeline. The Republic of Texas had limited manpower, a shaky economy, and now it was bleeding men to border violence with no end in sight.
So in that way, the Dawson Massacre becomes more than a tragedy, it becomes a political flashpoint. It added urgency to the push for U.S. statehood, which would eventually happen in 1845, just 3 years later.
And let's not forget the psychological impact. Texans began to see themselves as survivors. The story of Dawson and his men became part of a larger narrative, the idea that Texans were willing to face overwhelming odds, to fight even when defeat seemed certain.
A kind of remember Dawson attitude, echoing the famous remember the Alamo.
Exactly. In fact, in the years that followed, efforts were made to recover the remains of Dawson's men. In 1848, after the Mexican-American War ended and the U.S. had officially annexed Texas, the remains of the fallen were finally brought home.
They were reinterred at Monument Hill, just above the town of La Grange, overlooking the Colorado River. It's a peaceful place, with a view that stretches for miles, but there's something solemn about it too.
It's now the Monument Hill and Christchey Brewery State Historic Site. Try saying that 5 times fast. But it's worth visiting. There's a tomb there, built into the hillside, with the names of the Dawson men and others who died in the struggle to defend Texas.
For a long time, this site became a kind of sacred ground for Texans. Annual memorials were held there, especially in the 19th and early 20th centuries, as Texans honored the sacrifices that helped shape their state.
And it's not just local memory. The Dawson Massacre is still taught in Texas history classes today, though often briefly. But when you dig into it, the story reveals so much about the fragility of the Republic, the price of independence, and the legacy of volunteer militias in shaping the American West.
It's also a reminder that not all battles are won, or even fair. But sometimes, the impact of a loss echoes louder than a victory. Before we move on, we want to take a moment to spotlight one of the very few men who survived the Dawson Massacre, and whose story helps put a human face on the tragedy.
His name was James Nichols. He was just 21 years old at the time of the ambush. A young man from Fayette County who volunteered like many others, probably never imagining he'd be riding into a massacre.
When the Mexican troops opened fire with artillery, Nichols was one of the first to recognize how hopeless the situation was. The men were in an open field, pinned down, with cannonballs slicing through the air and musket fire coming from multiple directions.
And somehow, he managed to escape. According to later accounts, Nichols grabbed a wounded comrade and tried to carry him to safety, but had to leave him behind under withering fire. In the chaos, he sprinted on foot through brush and trees, dodging bullets, using every ounce of instinct and adrenaline just to survive.
He didn't stop running until he reached safety. He made it back to Caldwell's main force and reported what had happened, delivering the first news of the slaughter at Salado.
Can you imagine the weight of that? Surviving something like that, knowing so many of your friends were dead or captured, and being the one to tell the tale?
Nichols lived to tell his story, and like many survivors of Texas's early days, he kept it alive through oral history, passing it down through his family and community. He later settled in Texas and lived out his days as a respected citizen, but he never forgot what happened in 1842.
He once said, "I never knew courage like I saw that day, and I hope I never see it again."
It's stories like that, raw, personal, and deeply human, that remind us this isn't just about battles and borders. It's about people. Young men with hopes, families, futures, and the brutal choices they had to make. Alright, so we've covered the events, the aftermath, and even a survivor's account. But let's zoom out a little. Why does the Dawson Massacre still matter today? Why should we remember a 15-minute ambush from over 180 years ago?
Well, for starters, it reminds us just how fragile the Republic of Texas really was. We often picture early Texas as this bold, swaggering land of independence and grit, and sure, there's truth to that. But this massacre exposes the deeper reality: Texas was constantly walking a tightrope.
Right. The Republic didn't have a standing army, didn't have reliable intelligence, and didn't even have clearly defined borders. What it did have was volunteers, and that's both a strength and a weakness. Dawson's men rode into battle out of patriotism, but they were outgunned and outmaneuvered because the Republic couldn't coordinate its own defense properly.
And that kind of military vulnerability made it painfully clear that Texas couldn't survive indefinitely on its own. Incursions like Wool's and the disastrous loss of men like Dawson's company pushed public opinion steadily toward annexation.
It's no coincidence that the Dawson Massacre happened just 3 years before Texas became the 28th state in the Union. For many Texans, tragedies like this weren't just painful, they were persuasive. They made it clear that without the protection of the United States, Texas would always be at risk.
There's also the way this event shaped Texan identity. Remember, this was only 6 years after the Alamo. Texans were still defining who they were, and the Dawson Massacre became part of that rugged, stoic, frontier mythology. The idea that ordinary people, neighbors, farmers, teachers, would stand and fight for their land, even against impossible odds.
And that narrative isn't just about mourning the dead, it's about what they represented. Dawson's men embodied the kind of volunteerism, loyalty, and sacrifice that became core values in Texas's origin story.
But there's another layer here too, the cost of independence. It's easy to romanticize revolutions and declarations, but what this event shows is the slow, painful, and often bloody process of actually holding on to that freedom.
Exactly. It's one thing to win a revolution. It's another thing to survive as a nation afterward. The Dawson Massacre is a reminder that independence isn't just won in a single moment, it has to be defended, sometimes at great human cost.
And for historians, and just for citizens who want to understand where they come from, this kind of event matters because it reveals the human side of nation building. These weren't generals in polished uniforms. They were townspeople with muskets. Their deaths weren't just statistics, they were sacrifices, and they changed the course of history.
And they also changed the geography of remembrance. Sites like Monument Hill, where Dawson's men were reburied, still stand today. These aren't just historical markers, they're memorials, places of reflection that continue to tell their story long after the cannons went silent.
So yeah, maybe the Dawson Massacre doesn't show up in every U.S. history textbook, but in Texas? It's a quiet cornerstone of the state's legacy. A moment that said, we're willing to fight. We're willing to die. But we're also learning, we can't do it alone.
And maybe that's the biggest lesson of all. The past isn't just about glory. Sometimes, it's about the hard truths that shape our future.
If you enjoyed this episode, please take a moment to rate and review us on your favorite podcast app. It really helps the show grow.
Yeah, a 5-star review is like handing us a metaphorical musket and saying we believe in you. Plus, it helps other history nerds find the show.
Got a topic you want us to cover? Hit us up on social media, we love your suggestions. And don't forget, we've got new merch. T-shirts, mugs, and even a tote bag that says "Ask me about my favorite revolt."
You can find a link in the show notes, and remember, all our episodes are evergreen, so you can listen in any order, anytime.
Thanks for joining us. We'll catch you next time on
the History AI Podcast. Looking for the perfect way to show appreciation for the incredible mom in your life? Discover Exhausted Moms, a coloring journey to relaxation and humor, the coloring book that speaks directly to the heart of motherhood. Gift her an escape into pages of laughter, empowerment, and moments of tranquility. With Exhausted Moms, she'll find a blend of whimsical illustrations and inspiring quotes that celebrate her daily triumphs and challenges. Crafted with love from images I created for the mother of my children, each page offers a space for creativity and relaxation, a reminder that she's doing an amazing job, even on the toughest days. Give the gift of laughter, peace, and recognition. Exhausted Moms isn't just a coloring book, it's a hug, a nod of understanding, and a token of appreciation for everything she does. Surprise her with Exhausted Moms today and watch her face light up with joy. Because every mom deserves a moment to herself, wrapped in the colors of love and support.
The sun was low over the Texas land when Captain Dawson made his stand. 50 men with hearts so brave rode to meet what fate would pay. They heard the cry, the call to fight, to aid their kin in morning's light. With rifles worn and spirits high, they rode beneath the open sky. Oh, Salado Creek runs cold and deep, where brave men lie in silent sleep. For freedom's dream they took their place, and met the fire with solemn grace. But down the trail the vultures flew, for hundreds came in coats of blue. The cannons roared, the earth it cried, and blood like rain began to slide. No quarter given, no chance to flee, just smoke and flame and misery. In fields of dust they fell as one, beneath the unforgiving sun. Oh, Salado Creek runs cold and deep, where brave men lie in silent sleep. For freedom's dream they took their place, and met the fire with solemn grace. Tell their story, sing their name, let no one say they died in vain. Though time may dim the battle's flame, their echoes live in Texas rain. They found the rest in shallow ground, their letters lost, no trumpet sound. But every breeze that shakes the trees still whispers tales of men like these. Final, oh, Salado Creek runs cold and deep, where freedom's watch is ours to keep. For those who rode and those who fell, we ring the bell.